You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. History, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Goku. Running a little bit late. I apologize. But I'm here. We're going to discuss this paper by Dr. John Henrik CLARKE, Ancient Civilizations of Africa, the Missing Pages in World History. I want to thank everyone who's here with me today. I see we already have Kevin Care 42 in the room. NYC Beauties is in the room. Let me know if you guys can hear me. YouTube is always doing something weird with my stream. 1 minute it'll say no data, then it'll say stream is healthy, then I have this error. Can you guys hear me? Let me know if you can hear me, please. So NYC Beauties is here, Kevin Care 42 is here. Black Excellence is here. Says this is going to be a great one tonight. B1 Black First, hashtag Black First. Kevin Care 42 says Mr. Tyrone Muhammad tried to defend a black woman's honor from a racist Asian nail salon, only to be cursed by a street urchin wanting her nails done. Right? I guess that's a recent story that happened. Can you guys hear me? It's an important thing to know. Tonight? Okay, seems like I'm coming through. No one's just responding. Okay, it is what it is. So I just want to remind you guys quickly before I start reading this paper that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows you should be checking out on the podcast network, for instance.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
There's also the Queen's Council podcast you guys should be tuned into as well. Okay, make sure to check out all those shows on KWAZ Radio. Also, make sure you guys subscribe to KWAZ Radio's YouTube channel as well. Subscribe to the channel as well. Let's get some, let's get those numbers up over there. All right. So if you're subscribed to any of the shows, my show, Harsh Reality Podcast, in fact, you should be subscribed to all of them. And once you subscribe to all the shows on the network, of course, you should be subscribed to the network as well. Okay. I see folks are typing ones in the chat room, so everyone's hearing me. That's good. Black Excellence says to Kevin Care 42, we got to stop helping these women and help the black women that's on board. That's absolutely true. Someone, before I get into this paper, someone hit me up the other day on the I think it was the last episode that I did, and there was I think Kevin Care 42 brought it up about some queer black woman who was found strangled, and they're saying it was as they usually do, they said it was a a suicide or something like that. And I had my comments, and I said, my comments might come across as cold. If so, wear a sweater. And someone decided to have comments from me under the video. How dare I dismiss the black woman, the queer black woman, this, that, and the other. Listen, history shows that these folks are, you know, queer and some others tend to be quote unquote intersectional, and they tend to side with their sexuality above and before their race. A lot of LGBTQRSTUV WXYZ black folks are integrationists. That's just the reality of it. And I don't have time for them. And as the commenter pointed out, that not all black folks are black first. I don't have time for those black folks either. I just don't have time for you. If you've shown yourself to be an enemy of the rest of us, then you're an enemy to the rest of us. Anyway, again, thank you all for being here. Let's get into the reading tonight. Let's get into the reading tonight. Let me make sure I have the right one. Sorry about that. Gotta figure out where the paper is itself. Okay, here we go. So, Ancient Civilizations of Africa, the missing pages in world history. And like I said, this paper is by the beloved Dr. John Henrik CLARKE. The idea for an 8-volume general history of Africa with major emphasis on the African point of view was first announced at the inaugural meeting of the International Congress of African Studies in Accra in 1961. This was a radical departure from the opinion on Africa, its history, and its people then prevailing in the Western academic community. The colonizers of Africa had repeatedly proclaimed that the African people had no history. The African independence explosion, starting with Ghana in 1957 and the proliferation of African states speaking for themselves, helped to influence this change. We shall devote this article to reviewing Volume 2 of this work. In the booklet entitled Preparation for a General History of Africa, published by UNESCO in 1979, the following description of the project is given. Quote, in 1964, the General Conference of UNESCO, as part of the organization's effort to further the mutual understanding of peoples and nations, authorized the Director General to take the necessary measures for the preparation and publication of a general history of Africa. It was considered that such a project would add significantly to our knowledge of the history of mankind. In particular, it was felt to be a matter of urgency to study the past of Africa at a time of intense and rapid change, when the continent's traditional institutions and their forms of expressions were being threatened by an economic, social, and cultural evaluation that was, in great measure, unplanned and uncontrolled. It was also felt that the project would provide a factor of cultural continuity among peoples and nations which had recently acceded to independence, by enabling them to have a clearer understanding of their own identity with the past and with the present. So the second volume of this work is devoted mainly to the relationship of Egypt with the Nile Valley nations in the south. There is a need to extend this information in order to identify Egypt and the civilization as a distinct African creation, with no original indebtedness to Western Asia, called the Middle East, or to Europe, which did not exist during the formative years of Egypt's development. If Egypt is an enigma in world history, it is an enigma by design and created by Western historians, travelers, and adventurers. There are notable exceptions to this charge, beginning with the eyewitness account of the great Greek traveler Herodotus. Herodotus was the first writer to refer to the probable southern African origins of the people who would later be called Egyptians. He and other European writers, generally neglected, saw the Nile River as a great cultural highway, bringing people and creative talent out of inner Africa. These migrations constantly renewed the energy and genius of ancient Egypt until it became the greatest nation the world has ever known. Archaeological discoveries, old and new, have contributed to our knowledge of Egypt and its relationship to the Near East and the nations of Southeast Africa. Professor Cyrus H. Gordon, in an article titled Ancient Israel and Egypt, states, quote, "The ancient culture of Egypt was like a closed book, reopened recently by 19th and 20th century excavators and decipherers. Nevertheless, many Egyptian customs adopted by the Hebrews and recorded in the Bible became part of Western civilization." Gordon tells us further that Egypt had enough water to support a large population. Egypt is located at the crossroads of three continents, a meeting place for cultures and conflicts. The tragic uniqueness of Egypt is that it is an African nation that has been ruled by invaders for more than 2,000 years. No book on Egypt is going to be understood until the latter is properly located on the map of human geography. In his book, African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, the Senegalese writer Sheikh Anta Diop has said in effect that, quote, "Ancient Egypt is an African civilization. The history of Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians connect it with the history of Egypt. The African historian who evades the problem is neither modest nor objective nor unruffled. He is ignorant, cowardly, and neurotic." In my opinion, the African historian who is honest and competent in this field should frontally approach the subject of Egypt and its place in African history with explanations but no apologies. And I agree with that. Right? I think for African people, period, right, we should approach Egypt with explanations and not apologies. Right? The pro-black perspective is here saying peace, peace, peace to you. Only to I say. Black Excellence says, "My problem with Europeans claiming to be ancient Egyptians is how their pale selves live in that environment. Look at the Sphinx. What is the face structure of a black person?" Absolutely. I mean, we know these guys are clowns, right? Let's just call it what it is. We know they're clowns, but the problem is the masses. The masses don't push back and call them out on it. And even more importantly, a lot of our historians, right? A lot of our people who go into history, become historians, they don't push back on it either, right? To continue, he must stop being shy about having a strong difference of opinion with Western historians. That's just what I was saying. Like, they don't push back. You know, they're afraid, you know, to say what it is. You know, it is our responsibility to examine the best research on this subject and both ask and answer the question, quote, "Exactly who were the Egyptians of the ancient world?" End of quote. Herodotus repeatedly refers to them as being black-skinned people with woolly hair. Right? Here's a quote. "They have the same tint of skin which approaches that of the Ethiopians." Job reminds us that Herodotus may have been mistaken when he reports on the people and customs of Africa, but we must grant that he was at least capable of recognizing the skin color of the inhabitants of the countries he visited. The opinions of some of the neglected writers on the subject is summed up by Gaston Maspero in his monumental 2-volume work entitled The Dawn of Civilization, when he says, quote, "By almost unanimous testimony of the ancient historians, they belong to an African race which first settled in Ethiopia on the Middle Nile. Following the course of the river, they gradually reached the sea." The basis of, and you know, if you go and you listen to the pro-black perspective on from Sunday. And he was talking about the Ma'ar Federation and the origins of the area, right? You guys could go and check out, and he was referencing a particular book, right? You guys could go back and check out that episode as well, and you can get even more information there. In the chat room, the Pro Black Perspective says, Jope telling it like it is. NYC Sports Archive says, Lord Caravan, man that raided King Tut's tomb, and his British counterparts are thieves. Even the Greeks are trying to this day to get the Elgin marbles back. Thing is messed up, right? I'm trying to get the Elgin marbles back. NYC Beauty says, to me, with technology, we are getting knowledge out to black people of the world. The Mzungus hate that. The new black media and this movement is infuriating them. Goes on to say, Black Excellence says, the pyramids in Sudan, Nubia, predates the pyramids in Giza. Yeah, there's definitely, I mean, there's clearly a movement along the Nile, and we were building, right? We were building as we moved, and we were refining the processes, the techniques, the technology as we moved further and further down the Nile. Yeah, the Pro Black Perspective posted a book. I couldn't remember the name. Before Egypt, the Ma'ar Confederation, Africa's First Civilization. The Pro Black Perspective says that's the book. It's poorly edited, but it's a start. All right. I actually have that book, and I never got through all of it. So that's something I thought about the other day when I listened to that episode of the Pro Black Perspective. I need to really sit down with it and go through it. And again, if you are out there and you're listening, you know about the curriculum we're trying to build. You know, it's information that would be in a book like that, for instance, that you know, we would like to get out to our children, to our learners, right? When we talk about history lessons, right? Speaking of that, you know, Nikki Wren was in the chat room. If it's not the last time, it's the time before we did a live stream, and she was talking about these Yoruba books, and she did post them in the Discord. And if you're not on the Discord, you know, I have it pinned at the top of the chat. You know, join the Discord. Growing number of books in the library, a lot of information on investing and whatnot. You know, come through and you know, one of the books I have that I'm going to put up there tonight is the Handbook of Yoruba Religious Concepts. Right, that's one of the books she mentioned by Baba Karede, and as it turns out, I have that book already on PDF. Join the Discord and you could grab that book as well. I'll post it later tonight. So to continue, the basis of the Egyptian dilemma among Western historians is that they have rested the foundation of what is called quote-unquote Western civilization on the false assumption that the Egyptians of the ancient world were not a distinct African people. To do this, they had to ignore great masterpieces on Egyptian history and world history in general, written by white historians who did not support this point of view. Some of these include Gerald Massey's classic 6-volume work, Ancient Egypt, The Light of the World, The Natural Genesis, and A Book of the Beginnings, right? 2 volumes of each of those. Right? Other neglected works on the relationship of Egypt to the peoples and nations south of her borders are historical researches into the politics, intercourse, and trade of the Carthaginians. Ethiopians and Egyptians by A.H.L. Heron, and Ruins of Empires and the Law of Nature by Count C.F. Volney. All right. Volney was one of the most alert of the 19th century travelers in Africa. When he observed the similarities between the ruins of ancient Egypt, Ethiopia, and what is now the Sudan, his comment was, quote, "A people now forgotten, discovered, while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences. A race of men rejected for their sable skin and frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, these civil and religious systems which still govern the universe." These guys know what's up. These folks know what's up, right? We walk around here like we don't know what's going on. You know? Black Excellent adds Ivan van Sertima's books, Egypt and Egypt Revisited, right? But these guys know what's up. You know, we are the ones walking around here like zombies. Other able 19th century writers on Egypt drew attention to the evidence indicating the Southern African origins of its people and culture. In his book, Egypt, Sir E.A. Wallace Budge, and I believe I have this book up on the Discord, states that, quote, "The prehistoric native of Egypt, both in the Old and the New Stone Ages, was an African, and there's every reason for saying that the early settlers came from the South," end of quote. He further states that, quote, "There are many things in the manners and customs and religions of the historic Egyptians that suggest that the original home of their prehistoric ancestors was in a country in the neighborhood of Uganda and Punt. Some historians have indicated that the biblical land of Punt was in the area now known as Somalia." I'm going to pause here for a quick station ID break. Before I go, I see Black Excellence says those invaders, descendants today living in Egypt, descended from the Mongolians, not the original people of Kent. Well, yeah, I mean, you know, that's why they are the invaders. They're not the original people. Right? These are imposters. And it's a shame that, you know, these folks now can, not just now, but for some time now, have been controlling, you know, a very dear, right, and historic place for African people and their history. It's absolutely a shame. You know, Kevin Care42 says, "Look at the Sahara Rock Art. These works predate the Sahara Desert and ancient Egypt. It shows black people." Right? I think the pro-black perspective mentioned that as well in his last episode. So make sure to go check it out. I'm going to take a quick station ID break here. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Also check out the Queen's Council podcast, also on KWAZ Radio. So let's continue this paper. This is not a long paper, you know, so this is not going to be a long episode, which is cool by me. Sometimes you need to have shorter episodes. Writing on their origins continued into the 20th century. In her book, A Tropical Dependency, an outline of the ancient history of the Western Sudan with an account of the settlement of Nigeria. What a title. Let me read that title again. A Tropical Dependency, an outline of the ancient history of the Western Sudan with an account of the settlement of Nigeria. Lady Lugard, Flora L. Shaw, makes the following statement. That almost sounds like a dissertation she turned into a book, but she makes the following statement, quote, the ancient civilization of Egypt spread, as we know, from south to north, and without venturing to accept or reject the assumption of some learned writers that it came originally by way of the Arabian Gulf from India. There is seemingly no doubt about the earliest seat of civilization in Africa was the country watered by the Upper Nile, which was known by the name of Ethiopia to the ancients. The principal state of this Ethiopian country bore the well-known name of Meroe. The capital of Meroe was a city of the same name, which stood a little below the present Shendi, under 17 degrees north latitude and in 32 degrees east latitude. This is not the place, nor am I competent to discuss the arguments which form the ground of belief that the civilization of Meroe preceded that of Egypt. It is enough to say, very briefly, that on the site of the city of Meroe there exists remains of temples and pyramids, from which archaeologists have drawn the conclusion that the pyramid was a form of architecture native to Meroe, and only afterwards brought to perfection in Egypt. It is evident from the decoration of the temples that they were dedicated to the worship of Ammon. Right? Again, last episode of the Pro-Black Perspective talks about Ammon, etc. So you should check that out. It is believed that the remains of the temple of the most famous oracle of Jupiter, Ammon, are to be found in ruins at about 8 hours' journey to the northeast of Shendi. This temple of the oracle was known to exist within a few hours of Meroe. The priestly traditions of Ethiopia and Egypt assert that the worship of Ammon and Osiris, with his feasts and processions, was settled at the metropolis of Meroe. This remarkable spot is regarded by the ancients as the cradle of the arts and sciences, where hieroglyphic writing was discovered, and where temples and pyramids had already sprung up, while Egypt still remained ignorant of their existence. She continues her explanation in the following manner, quote, the carvings of the monuments of Meroe show people in possession of the arts and luxuries of civilization, and having some knowledge of science. On the base of one of the monuments, a zodiac has been found, and in the more northerly monuments of Nubia, which portray the conquest of Meroe by Ramses the Great of Egypt, at a much later date, the conquered nation is shown as being not only rich, civilized, and important, but also possessing tributary states, whence came giraffes and other Central African products. We learn from these same monuments that the women of Meroe appeared to live on equal terms with men. They were constantly portrayed as queens. The empire of Meroe had its settled constitution and laws. The monuments, though eloquent, are not the only ground upon which this conclusion has been reached. The conclusion that the arts, sciences, and religion descended from Nubia to the lower country of Egypt. The fame of the Ethiopians was widespread in ancient history. Herodotus describes them as the tallest, the most beautiful, and long-lived of the human race. And before Herodotus, Homer, in even more flattering language, described them as the most just of men, the favorites of the gods. The annals of all the great nations in Asia Minor are full of them. The Mosaic records allude to them frequently, but while they are described as the most powerful, the most just, and the most beautiful of the human race, they are constantly spoken of as black, and there seems to be no other conclusion to be drawn from that. At that remote period in history, the leading race of the Western world was a black race. right? You know, wouldn't that be great in a curriculum for young learners? Wouldn't that be great for young learners to read that type of thing? The pro-black perspective dropping some knowledge here. Lady Lugard allegedly named Nigeria. That's what some people are saying. Okay. Interesting. I missed some comments here. NYC Beauty says all these outside groups know who we are. They know that we are rising again. Their lies are not working anymore. That movie they released a few years ago, Gods of Egypt, bombed. Black people were calling out Hollywood for making it. Kevin K42 says by the time the Greek invaded Kemet, it was in decline. Black Excellence says when ancient Egyptians buried their dead, their heads were always pointing south into Africa. Black Excellence goes on to say Hathor, Isis's sister, the goddess of love, was worshipped long before Aphrodite in ancient Greece. NYC Beauty says the Nubians were smelting iron long before any ancient Europeans. And there you go. The thing is that you know, one of the things that I don't think we actively work on, I'm talking about conscious folks, we don't actively work on how to take this information and convert it into action, right? How do you take this information and convert it to action? For example, how do you take this information and recreate it today? And I feel like we don't directly do that. I feel like we deal in a lot of self-serving, you know, a lot of self-service in boosting our ego off of the greatness that we clearly were, right? The leading race amongst men, right? But what we need to do is to take that, raise the self-esteem of our people, and then not just raise the self-esteem off of the, you know, this ancient history, but figure out how can we replicate this today, replicate and modernize what they did in ancient times. How can we do it today? Right? It's cool that we know this stuff. It's not cool that we know this stuff and we're not using it as fuel to do something great. Again, we have the ability to create. And this notion that white supremacy is stopping you from being able to do anything is nonsense that we gotta stop doing. Kevin K42 says whatever the Europeans touch turns to shit. NYC Beauties agree. But that's my thing. A lot of us love the history. We love learning this history of, you know, from whence we came. But the problem is we're not using it as a motivation to do anything. Even more recent history, like Garvey and those guys, we're not, you know, for the most part, we're not really doing much with that information. We're not doing much with those philosophies, those opinions, you know, and that irks me. Right? But that's a nice quote that John Henrik CLARKE uses here in this paper. To continue, new evidence, archaeological and otherwise, supports her conclusions, right, with respect to this neglected aspect of African history. In an article on ancient Nubian artifacts in New York Times of March 1st, 1979, Boyce Rensberger reveals that, quote, evidence of the oldest recognizable monarchy in human history, preceding the rise of the earliest Egyptian kings by several generations, has been discovered in artifacts from ancient Nubia in Africa. Until now, it had been assumed that at the time, the ancient Nubian culture, which existed in what is now northern Sudan and southern Egypt, had not advanced beyond a collection of scattered tribal clans and chiefdoms. The existence of rule by kings indicates a more advanced form of political organization, in which many chiefdoms are united under a more powerful and wealthier ruler. The discovery is expected to stimulate a new appraisal of the origins of the origins of civilization in Africa, raising the question of to what extent later Egyptian culture may have derived its advanced political structure from the Nubians. The various symbols of Nubian royalty that have been found are the same as those associated in later times with Egyptian kings. The new findings suggest that the ancient Nubians may have reached this stage of political development as long ago as 300 BC. I think that means 3,300 BC. Several generations before the earliest documented Egyptian king. Right? 3,000 BC. Like Kevin Care42 said in the chat room, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Help this channel to grow. Also, you'll see scrolling by is the Cash App. By all means, if you can, donate to the show. Cash App, $BitterMeds, BITTERMEDZ. Right? Proceeds go towards improving the show, building the channel, etc. Okay. Black Excellence says to me, the ancestors passed the baton. Some of us dropped it, and these outsiders used it to build, while at the same time shutting us out. He says, look up Narmer. There is a palette in the Egyptian Museum destroying the outsiders and uniting all of Kemet. Did you mean to say there is a painting? There is a palette, maybe a painting, perhaps. Right? But Black Excellence makes a point. Our ancestors, our ancient ancestors, they built. They organized, they built, they had nations, right? There was something to look upon, and a couple of things happened, and the baton was dropped. We've had long enough time to pick up the baton, right? And we should be continuing what our ancestors started. In fact, we should be improving upon what our ancestors started, right? We're almost done. I see people are dropping off, but that's okay. In the September-October 1980 issue of Archaeology magazine, Professor Bruce Williams of the University of Chicago wrote a more extensive article on the same subject entitled, quote, The Lost Pharaohs of Nubia. This was widely read and discussed nationally and internationally in the academic community. Because information about Africa, its history, people, and culture is changing faster than books can be written, it is possible to write about Africa and miss some of the most important aspects of this information. The contributors to the second volume of UNESCO's General History show no indication that they have read any of the large body of books, monograms, pamphlets, and conference papers on African history written by writers of African descent in Africa, the Caribbean islands, and in the Americas, mainly the United States. These writings began to appear early in the 19th century In his book, The Rising Sun, first published in 1874, William Wells Brown devotes 3 chapters to the African background to Black American history. 3 chapters to the African background to Black American history, beginning with a chapter on, quote, the Ethiopians and the Egyptians, end of quote. You know, as I'm reading this, I just remembered a little while back, I got a comment, and it's funny, like, I'll get these notifications on my phone that there's a comment under a video, and I can see, you know, a part of the comment on my phone, but when I click it to go read the whole comment, it's gone. So I guess the commenter had deleted it, but it was an episode I did about reading a John Henrik CLARKE paper where he was talking about Africans in America being immigrants against their will. I don't know if you guys remember that, but I see Dorico Cooper Photography is here saying peace, family, peace to you too, right? And you know, I did the episode, and here comes someone I assume to be ADOS, FBA, whatever. How dare you Africans tell us that we're African? Where do you guys get off on telling us that we're African and blah, blah, blah? And again, I couldn't see the entire comment, but because when I went to look at the, you know, click the entire comment, it was gone. So I guess the person must have realized it was kind of silly what they said, because listen, newsflash, Dr. John Henrik CLARKE is an African from America, or an African in America, right? What some would call an ADOS or FBA or what have you, and he's telling you this. And what kills me is that these folks will exalt Dr. John Henrik CLARKE on the one hand, and then ignore everything he says about the fact that you were brought here on slave ships on the other hand. And I just thought I'd bring that up because I'm reminded that I'm reading Dr. John Henrik CLARKE paper, and I also am reminded, you know, sometimes I get these comments that are just wild, right? I see KW Don 7 is in the house. Peace to KW Don 7. I said Dorico Cooper Photography is here as well. Peace to all you guys for coming through. I appreciate you guys. I actually won't be here that much longer because it's a relatively short paper and I'm mostly through it, right? But in this last part, Dr. John Henrik CLARKE says in his book, which is also, I mentioned the comment, The Rising Sun, first published in 1874, William Wells Brown devotes 3 chapters to the African background to Black American history, beginning with a chapter on, quote, Ethiopians and the Egyptians, end of quote. The interest in the subject continued and is reflected in the works of David Walker and Martin Delaney. In 1829, Walker published his appeal to the African citizens of the world, calling on them to take up arms against their white oppressors. Who has that kind of balls today? You guys name some folks who has that level of balls today, right? Calling on them to take up arms against their white oppressors. In the same year, Robert Alexander Young published the Ethiopian Manifesto. These men were searching for their African identity that the slave stem had attempted to destroy. Current with their search for an identity in the United States, they were searching for an identity in the world, which means in essence an identity as human beings with a history before and after slavery that can command respect. Which is the other part of the ADOS FBA thing that's real weird to me. It's like you're starting your origin story from the plantation. There's no respect in that. You You're here today, so it means you survived it. Great. But there's no real respect in that. And when you talk about the world stage, there's no respect in that. Right? The Britons were slaves. Right? And were slaves in Rome. And they got those shackles up off of them and became a superpower. Those guys can talk about that type of shit. You know, KW Don 7 says John Henrik CLARKE would not be down with the FBA ADOS nonsense. I agree with that too. Because we have enough words from the great Dr. CLARKE that he basically said, look, like one of the speeches he's given that I really appreciate, he says, listen, be proud of where you're from, I mean, we're all born somewhere, right? You can be proud of where you're from, but just understand that you're an African still. You could be born in Haiti, you're an African by way of Haiti, you're an African by way of Jamaica, by way of the Bahamas, by way of Canada, whatever. But at the end of the day, you're still African. Right? Kevin Care 42 says Tariq is a cult of personality. Tariq is a cult of personality. So today, as a matter of fact, funny enough, the good brother Onita Say from the pro-black perspective, I know I've mentioned him enough times. If I was taking a drink each time, I'll be drunk. But today I saw on Twitter where he let me see, what was the post again? He was posting how there was a bunch of folks who were talking about they bought like Tariq's latest movie, which is Bug Breaking, right? And it's so crazy to see the number of people who have posted that they've bought this DVD. And my main comment, because of course it's crazy, but my main comment to it was like, yo, what's really crazy about it is like folks paid for that. Folks paid for that documentary. Tariq doesn't put no money up. Folks pay for it, and he gets the profit, right? And like I said last episode, I don't mind people having businesses. Folks write books, folks might do documentaries, folks might do audio plays, whatever it is. I don't mind you selling to, but what I don't like is when you totally take advantage of the people, our people. That's what I don't like, when you totally take advantage of our people. And that's what this guy does. And it's crazy to see how many people follow this guy. And I saw someone make a comment in that thread with the pro-black perspective. They said that this dude, Dane Calloway, has an even bigger platform than Tariq. And, like Kevin Care 42 said earlier, mental health is bad in our community, man. Damn. Draco Cooper Photography says, hit the like button to show attendance, share, and subscribe. I just checked in, and in 2 minutes, I can already tell that everyone on my contact list needs to hear this podcast. I appreciate that, Dorico. KW Don 7 says, congrats to Yvette Carnell on her engagement to her Urugu girlfriend. She claimed that love has no color, yet she is fighting for reparations. FOH. Y'all know what that means. And if you don't, get the fuck out of here, right? Kevin Care 42 says he just uploaded The Rising Sun, or The Antecedents and Advancement of the Colored Race by Brown. Did you put that on the Discord, you mean? That'd be dope if you did that. If you put that, oh yeah, you put it on the Discord, I see it. Yeah, that's dope. That's dope. That's dope. So now folks can actually read the work that was mentioned in this paper. And that's one of the things. That's one of the things. I don't know if people have really peeped that. But when you read a paper, whenever you can come across a paper by Dr. John Henrik CLARKE, it's the references for me, man. Like, you go through the references of any one of his works that has references, that has a bibliography, and it's the references for me. Because what I like about him is that he doesn't shy away from knowledge. He'll take it from wherever it's spoken, or wherever, whomever, whatever. He'll take the knowledge and he'll incorporate it, right, in his stream of thought, right? So like Derico Cooper said, yeah, this is an episode a bunch of people need to check out. The Pro-Black Perspective says Dane is an effing nutcase. I would agree. Kevin Kerr says it's under the BM library. Yes, sir. I see it. I appreciate you for putting that there. All right. But Yvette Carnell married a white. Oh, so she was denying this for the longest time, that she wasn't with no white woman. But I guess she is, and she's trying to get that little reparations for her and her little vanilla there. I see. Okay. That's how you know these folks are grifters, man. These folks don't even live by their own code. It's like when Umar was out here smashing the conscious stripper, saying he was celibate. You guys don't even live by your own code, by the shit you talk about. Anyway, to continue. The first formal attempt to write a history of African people in the United States, entitled History of the Negro Race in America, 1619 to 1880, published in 1883, George Washington Williams devoted the first 6 chapters of his book to the African background to the Black American history, right? In the closing years of the 19th century, the Africans in the Caribbean islands, South America, and the United States continued to object to the distorted pictures of Africans in elementary books, geographies, travel guides, and histories. As far back as 1881, the renowned Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden, on the occasion of his inauguration as president of Liberia College, sounded the note that called for a new approach to the teaching of African history and culture. He is the best known of the Caribbean scholars who returned to Africa. Of his many books, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, first published in 1887 and reprinted in 1967, is an enduring classic. Again, why I like Dr. John Henrik CLARKE, right? Pro-Black Perspective says Yvette got engaged. Apparently so. I guess there is someone for everyone. In the United States, W.E.B. Du Bois continued some of Blyden's work and carried it into the 20th century. His interest in Africa began early in life during his student days at Harvard University. As a result of this interest, he wrote his first major work, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States, in 1896, as a doctoral dissertation. This was continued in 2 other works, The Souls of Black Folks, 1903, and The Gift of Black Folks, 1924. During his editorship of Crisis Magazine, 1910 to 1934, he introduced Africa as a subject of concern for Black Americans. The Negro, published in 1915, was his first attempt to write a survey history of the African world. His little-known yet important essay, The African Roots of the War, was published the same year. In this essay, he dared to deal with the imperialist origins of the First World War and Africa in general. He was the first formally trained African-American historian, and his dissertation became the first title to be published in the Harvard Historical Studies series. That's one thing you'll notice too, which is another thing I like about Clarke. You know, Clarke tends to kind of endorse Du Bois often, and even though Du Bois was kind of adversarial towards Garvey, you know, Clarke still rocks with Garvey too. You know? Kevin Kerr says you can find these out-of-print books at Gutenberg.org, and he posts the link. So you have no excuse not to head over and find some of these out-of-print books. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Kevin Kerr, for you too. All right. It was with Carter G. Woodson, another Harvard PhD, that African world history took a great leap forward and found a defender who could document his claims. He was convinced that unless something was done to rescue the Africa people from history's oversight, they would become, quote, a negligible factor in the thought of the world, end of quote. In 1915, he founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, and his major book, The African Background Outlined, was published in 1936. Woodson approached African history as a part of world history. The Italian-Ethiopian War stimulated new interests in the subject. First, the Black American community wanted to know more about Ethiopia and its relationship to the rest of Africa. Dr. Willis N. Huggins, a high school history teacher, wrote 2 basic textbooks entitled A Guide to Studies in African History in 1934 and Information to African Civilization, 1937. Who has those books and who has read those books? Number 1, who has those books? And number 2, have you read those books before? What's your opinion of those books? Post that in the chat room. Right? We'll talk about that to continue. In 1947, the Jamaican writer J.A. Rogers published his most outstanding work, World's Great Men of Color, in 2 volumes. This is the enduring masterpiece in an African world biography. Before his death in 1966 at the age of 85, he had devoted at least 50 years of his life to researching the lives of great African personalities and their impact on world history. A number of recent books have validated the early claims of Rogers, who started his research at a time when a large number of African people had some doubts about their contribution to world history. In 1958, the American Society of African Culture published Africa as Seen by American Negroes. The editors compiled some of the best essays that Black American scholars had written on Africa during the preceding 10 years. In 1964, Ebony magazine published a series of articles on the ancient and medieval history of Africa by Professor William Leo Hansberry. This was the most extensive series of this nature ever to appear in a Black publication. The articles were extracted from a projected 4-volume history of Africa that Professor Hansberry had been writing for nearly a generation. Fortunately, this larger work was not finished before he died in 1965. However, 2 of his books, edited by Professor Joseph E. Harris, head of the History Department of Howard University, were published in 1974 and 1977. These are Pillars in Ethiopian History and Africa and Africans as Seen by Classical Writers. Right? Again, if you guys are familiar with some of these books, let me know. All right. During the Civil Rights Movement, called the American Black Revolution, interest in Africa led to a massive demand for Black studies, mostly by Black students at predominantly white universities. Right? A number of books by Black American scholars help to place Africa in proper historical focus during this period. In my opinion, some of the most important of these include The African Presence in Asia by Joseph E. Harris in 1971, Introduction to African Civilizations by John G. Jackson, which is a good one. The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD by Chancellor Williams. We did that in the book club back in the day. You could look up that episode where we reviewed it. And 3 books by Yosef Ben Yochanan, Black Man of the Nile, Africa, Mother of Western Civilization, and African Origins of the Major Western Religions. That African origins of the major Western religions, that could cause some problems today, because I don't know. I think is only time I say who started it out. Recently on Twitter, but there's been a pretty long going discussion about the Abrahamic religions. So that last title there might be a little bit problematic, because Dr. Ben was a self-proclaimed right? Wasn't he Uish? Self-proclaimed Uish? Anyway, but those are books, by the way. If any of you have these in PDF format, right? And I say PDF format because that's the best way to post them to the Discord. I'd like to put them in the Bitter Medicine library. So if you have any of these books in PDF format, I think I have Destruction of Black Civilization already. I think it's there, or I think I have it. By all means, forward those to me if you don't mind, and I'll post them in the library, because again, we need our folks reading. A reading people is a thinking people, and a thinking people should transfer to be a doing people, right? We need more doers now, you know. So if you have any of these titles that were mentioned, by all means, please forward them so that we can have them in the Discord for others to check out. African American and African Caribbean scholars from the early part of the 19th century to the present have made it their personal mission to reclaim African history. They repudiated the often repeated charge that Africans have no history. These scholars, in my opinion, helped to create the intellectual climate that called for a new approach to the subject. It is assumed that the contributors to the first 2 volumes of UNESCO's History of Africa are committed to bringing a new dimension to it, and this has been achieved in different ways by most of the contributors to Volume 2. Personally, as a reviewer and teacher of African history for more than a generation, I expected too much from the former. I expected at least one, other than Job, to deal with the academic hypocrisy about Egypt not being an African state. This is a continuation of the dialogue among scholars that started in the symposium. Quote, the people of ancient Egypt and the deciphering of Meroitic script, end of quote. Held in Cairo from January 28th to February 3rd, 1974. Some of the participants in the symposium have also contributed to this volume, which is a major step forward in correcting the misconceptions about African people that have prevailed universally. The fact that it falls short of my expectations only means that my expectations are severe indeed. A previous review by Dr. Roland Oliver of the University of London takes exception to the title because it promises more than it delivers. We have here some essays and notes towards a general history of Egypt, the nations of East and Southeast Africa, and some additional essays on ancient Africa in general, but still not enough to justify the title. I think Job's chapter, The Origin of the Ancient Egyptians, is a clear explanation of how Egypt related to the nations of the Nile Valley that were obviously the parents of Egypt. This volume could have been much improved had the contributors been acquainted with the previously quoted work of Chancellor Williams, who calls his second chapter Ethiopia's oldest daughter, Egypt. He also deals with another neglected aspect concerning the history of the invaders of Africa, with major emphasis on the invaders from Western Asia, now referred to as the Middle East. Jackson is particularly enlightening in his chapter called Egypt and the Evolution of Civilization. So this is about to bring us to the end of this paper. And again, I'd like to put it out there. If you guys have any of these books in PDF format, or if you have the book and can convert it to PDF, that'll be cool too. But you know, if you have them, you know, make sure to pass them along to me so that I could put them up. I'll be looking for some of these papers in this paper to perhaps read in future episodes. When any book is written that approaches a definitive history of Africa, there's some general subjects that will have to be approached with honesty. One being the myth of the invader and conqueror as a quote-unquote civilizer, right? The writer will have to be bold enough to admit that invaders and conquerors never spread civilization. Rather, they spread a way of life at the expense of the vanquished people. Man, damn, that was well written right there. Africa is the most invaded of all the continents, and every invader did Africa more harm than good. That whole paragraph was just fire. This criticism and these exceptions do not mean that I look negatively upon this monumental effort of UNESCO to sponsor a new general history of Africa. As I have looked forward to the first 2 volumes, I look forward even more anxiously to the 6th volume still to come. On numerous occasions, Chancellor Williams has said that history can no longer be written by an individual historian working alone. Scholars of other disciplines must now join the historian, each defining his own area of specialty. You know, I have that same mindset about curriculum. Teachers and administrators and whatnot, they can't be the ones creating a curriculum. It has to be an effort, right? It has to be an effort for people who have mastered different topics and can bring their insight to this collective work, right? And I agree with Chancellor Williams. No one person can really, you know, put together the entire history of, say, Africa, right? You got to get archaeologists, cartographers, geologists, you know, etc. You have to get different peoples, you know, culturists, linguists. You have to get different peoples involved to really tell the story, right? To continue, without history, people are without direction. History, in the final analysis, is the compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. And it is the clock they use to tell their special time of day. History tells the people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells the people where they still must go and what they still must be. And that's nothing but a word at the end there. You see, it's cool to discuss history, and it's cool to feel the euphoria that comes from knowing that we had, you know, we participated in this great past. But what we got to really focus on in retelling these stories is how far we are from it. And so how far we still have to go. And that's my point. My point is, revel in your history, but understand that the history is showing you just how far you got to go still. We still got to get back to that. we have a long ways to go. I want to thank everyone who was here participating in tonight's broadcast. Let me thank everyone who was here: Derico Cooper Photography, Kevin Care 42, the Pro Black Perspective, sorry. KW Don 7, as always, was here. Earlier on, we had Black Excellence was here. NYC Beauties was here. NYC Sports Archives was here, right? So we had a good number of folks here. Yeah, make sure you guys subscribe to KWAZ Radio's YouTube channel as well. All right, so that's the show tonight. Thank everyone who was participating in the chat room. Thanks to Kevin Care 42 for posting that book in the Bitter Medicine Library. If you're not on the Discord, you should be. All right, you shouldn't just listen to this episode in playback or what have you and not be a part of the Discord. Join the Discord. You too can check out these books that we have there, and let's have more conversations on the Discord as well. All right, until next time, this has been the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.